we're always able to work with anyone within the value chain. It's kind of funny. This is one of the great things about being on board. It doesn't matter how difficult some of the discussions or some of the conversation is around the board table. We're always able to go and have a beer afterwards type thing, because we got to support the barley industry, right? And I think everyone sort of enjoys that, and the fact that we can have different opinions, but it's still very respected opinions on both sides. We bring a lot of just kind of some basic common sense and basic sort of, well, what makes sense for producers today?
Welcome to the Barley Bin. SaskBarley's goal is to take you right into the barley bin, not a hopper bin or a bin with in-floor augers, but the kind you'd spend a bit of time shoveling, getting itchy. It's worth it for the pint or steak afterwards, or a golden nugget you sometimes find uncovering itchy topics.
I'm Mitchell Japp. This season, we are integrating a special 3-part series that dives into disease management. After this series, the season will continue with more interviews and topics for barley farmers and the barley industry. Our last series took us on a journey through barley variety development. Check it out for a fresh listen. But first, let's jump into the barley bin for some itchy topics. When we talk about managing disease in barley today, it's never a single fix. It's about an integrated approach, combining things like smarter fungicide timing, crop rotation, and seeding practices, and choosing varieties with built-in disease resistance. This is integrated disease management. It's a common term now, but did you know the idea of integrated disease management is not that old? This approach has been built slowly by researchers and farmers working through some pretty tough decades with fewer tools and less data than we have available now. Even 30 years ago, disease management wasn't about optimization. It was about damage control. Today, in our first episode of Season 3 of the BarleyBin Podcast, we're going to explore how our current approach to disease management in barley came to be and how it was pioneered and expanded by some of today's top barley disease experts, including Dr. Randy Kutcher, a plant pathologist and professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and Dr. Kelly Turkington, a barley pathologist at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Lacombe Research Centre. So now, let's take a trip back in time to the 1980s and 1990s, when Kutcher and Turkington were just starting their careers. Back at that time, barley mattered. Western Canada regularly produced well over 10 million tons of it each year, but it wasn't always treated like a first priority crop. It was often grown for feed, sometimes for malt, and usually on acres that weren't considered top tier. Farmer Zenith Faye, who's been growing barley for decades near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan, remembers it clearly.
Weather has always been the challenging factor. Barley at that time was something that was seeded later. It wasn't a priority as much.
Marginal acres tend to come with marginal conditions, uneven moisture, compaction, stress, all of which create openings for disease. With those acres came disease, but the list of problems looked different than it does today. Leaf diseases were front and center: leaf rust, net blotch, scald, and spot blotch. This disease landscape is where Kutcher entered the picture.
So my PhD was on common root rot and spot blotch of barley.
Okay.
That was my first introduction to barley.
After completing his PhD, Kutcher worked as a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for 15 years before joining the University of Saskatchewan in 2011, focused on cereal diseases. But back when he was working on his PhD, common root rot was a major concern across Western Canada. Root rot is caused by a complex of soil-borne fungi, and it thrives when crops are stressed, particularly in continuous cereals or tight rotations. But what made it particularly challenging was that it didn't always show dramatic symptoms above ground. Just like with other leaf diseases, net blotch didn't usually wipe out entire fields. Instead, it quietly reduced yield and quality, the kind of losses that add up year after year.
Common root rot doesn't take your whole field. It reduces yield by 10 to 15% at worst.
Those are losses that matter over time. and for farmers in the 1980s and early 1990s, this kind of yield loss was frustrating because it was hard to see, hard to measure, and even harder to fix. So a big part of Kutcher's early work focused on understanding how root diseases behaved in real prairie rotations, especially systems heavy in cereals. His early research showed that root disease risk increased in tight cereal rotations, and that rotation, not just in-season treatments, played a critical role in managing those diseases.
Genetic resistance is by far the best strategy, but not the only strategy, right?
Okay.
I keep harping on rotation because I think the two are equally effective. I mean, that's always been my interest, I guess. We were trying to look at cropping systems and to try to manage not only diseases, but just all kinds of agronomic factors, whether it be fertility or moisture or weed control, by, encouraging a more diverse crop rotation.
This knowledge helped shift recommendations away from continuous cereals and toward more diverse rotations, not just for yield, but for disease suppression. It was an early example of disease management being tied directly to cropping system decisions, not just in-season fixes.
I think we documented very clearly the benefits of 4 and 5. And I mean, even Guy Lafond at Indian Head had 6-year rotations, and Guy would always or quite often ask, could you come down and rate our disease? And I would say, Guy, you don't have any disease. You have maybe a bit of sclerotinia some years and the odd issue, but because we weren't dealing with fusarium head blight.
So the question researchers like Kutcher focused on at that time was not how to eliminate disease entirely, but rather how to manage it effectively in real farm systems. Another researcher focused on the same question was Kelly Turkington, who began his career at the Lacombe Research Center in the early 90s. He and Kutcher began collaborating early on.
I did quite a bit of work with him. So my work and Kelly's work has been more on the applied side. We've looked at things like fungicide timing, the interaction with varieties. Like for stripe rust, some varieties, they don't need to be sprayed. Their resistance is so good. Other varieties, yes, there will be a benefit.
Another exciting shift was happening around that time in the agriculture sector.
That was a really exciting time to be a young scientist. Producers were looking at moving from conventional tillage to conservation tillage, and especially direct seeding.
That shift changed everything. Direct seeding brought major benefits: better moisture conservation, reduced erosion, improved soil structure, but it also changed how diseases behaved. Crop residue stayed on the surface. Soil biology shifted. Root environments changed. Along with his colleagues, Turkington started asking new questions like, what happens to root diseases under direct seeding? What happens to pathogens that survive in crop residue?
It reduced the severity of common root rot in barley, and we attributed that to a more vibrant microbial environment in the soil under a direct seeding system.
At the time, this finding challenged the assumption that residue retention would increase disease pressure. Over time, Turkington's work showed the opposite could be true, depending on the disease and the system. It also showed that disease responses under residue were more complex than expected, and that blanket assumptions about tillage and disease risk didn't hold up across systems. That changed how the industry thought about disease risk. Instead of assuming that direct seeding would automatically increase disease, recommendations became more nuanced, emphasizing rotation, residue management, and soil health rather than tillage alone. That finding helped shift thinking in a big way. Disease wasn't just about spraying anymore, it was about systems.
We were trying to look at cropping systems and manage not only diseases, but just all kinds of agronomic factors, whether it be fertility or moisture or weed control, by encouraging a more diverse crop rotation.
In light of this, recommendations for farmers changed. Instead of promoting single solutions, pathologists like Kutcher and Turkington began emphasizing combinations of practices, an approach that became the backbone of integrated disease management. As evidence accumulated, extension recommendations became more targeted and were communicated back to farmers, who were for the most part open to these practical recommendations.
We often have been asked to go to field days. That's been an opportunity to discuss some of the work that we've done. And a lot of the integrated crop management work, we're not talking about technologies that are 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line, like some of our maybe more genomic type of approaches and seeing that ultimate practical benefit on farm. A lot of it could be readily adopted by producers.
However, these ideas didn't change things overnight. For many farmers, the transition to integrated disease management involved a lot of trial and error. Rotation lengths slowly increased. Barley followed different crops. More attention was paid to residue and field history. Fungicides were tested, dropped, and sometimes reintroduced when timing improved. But what mattered most was that farmers began seeing disease not as an isolated problem, but as something influenced by how the entire system was managed. Faye remembers his own approach shifting during this time period, away from reacting to individual disease problems towards a more integrated approach that combined variety selection, fungicides, and canopy management. He also began choosing varieties with better resistance and tweaking his spray decisions.
We started using fungicides at lower rates and just sort of experimenting with it. But our timing, we weren't very educated. And then advanced, newer varieties were coming on that had better resistance, moderate resistance to some of these diseases.
He also changed agronomic practices and canopy structure, understanding that fertility and standability affect airflow and disease pressure.
We see the advantages on not only disease, but on yield bumps and also standability, which also has a big impact on the disease pressure that you're going to get if the crop can get airflow through the main canopy. The disease it dries out and doesn't have that microclimate to help flourish the disease system.
Like Faye, many farmers at the time weren't aware of best practices when it came to fungicide applications, because much of that information didn't exist specifically for the prairies. Rates varied, products were fewer, and results were inconsistent. Researchers like Turkington realized that farmers needed better information to optimize their investments in these products. So he began doing research aimed at generating scientifically sound information for farmers about best practices for these products, ultimately helping them make informed decisions about when a fungicide spray was actually worth the money and when it wasn't. He also did research on other agronomic best practices.
Some of the integrated work that we did, looking at seed source, looking at rotation and fungicide application and nitrogen, those are all technologies that I think can be readily adopted. And to see how things like seeding rate actually help to improve malting quality.
Over the next couple of decades, Turkington's work in this area would answer lots of questions for farmers. For example, his work on fungicide timing showed that the best time for application is from flag leaf through to just after head emergence. Working with agronomists, he also tied seeding date, seeding rate, and nitrogen not just to yield and disease, but to malting quality in the plant and brewhouse. And overall, his work has demonstrated that farmers can get by with one well-timed fungicide spray, or sometimes none at all, so long as they start with clean seed, smart rotations, and resistant varieties. But generating these recommendations was only part of Turkington's contributions. Within the first decade of his career, Turkington says his program had shifted one of its main focuses to genetic resistance. In light of this, much of Turkington's research supported the development of this genetic resistance for future barley varieties by running disease nurseries, scoring lines, and feeding that data into breeders' selection and marker work.
Our initial efforts in terms of plant pathology were largely focused on screening for scald. Based on our surveys at the time, the three main disease issues that we were seeing in Alberta. Bit of a different story if you went to Manitoba and central to eastern Saskatchewan, is that we were looking at scald, netform net blotch, and spot form net blotch in our disease surveys. And in our nurseries and working and supporting the breeding programs here in Lacombe at the University of Saskatchewan and then Ag Canada in Brandon.
During this time, breeding programs began screening varieties more rigorously for disease tolerance, and pathologists worked directly with breeders to understand which traits mattered most under prairie conditions. This collaboration represented a major step forward. By the mid-1990s, industry and researchers alike understood that genetic resistance would be the foundation of disease management.
I've been able to look at barley disease management from a broad range of perspectives. So my own perspective as a pathologist, but also from the perspective of the breeding process and developing resistant varieties and developing tools that aid breeders in terms of identifying sources of resistance. So things like marker-assisted selection and DNA-based marker development. The whole area of disease resistance, it's a strategy that is very important for producers in that it provides a foundational strategy in terms of disease management.
Genetic resistance is by far the best strategy.
Because of these focused efforts, barley varieties with meaningfully improved disease resistance began appearing in Western Canada in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so, by the late 1990s, the Western Canadian barley disease research community had laid the groundwork for what would come next: better screening methods, ongoing research into best practices for fungicide use, and a systems-based understanding of disease and the importance of genetic resistance. What it hadn't fully faced yet was Fusarium head blight, a disease that was starting to spread more aggressively across the prairies and brought risks that had never been seen before. That turning point, when FHB, Fusarium head blight, moved from a regional concern to a prairie-wide problem, is where our next episode begins. In episode 2, we'll look at the early 2000s when Fusarium head blight reshaped barley pathology and pulled a new generation of researchers into the field, including Dr. James Tucker. For now, thanks for joining me on this first episode in this mini-series on disease management. I'm Mitchell Japp, and this has been episode 1 of our 3rd season of the BarleyBin Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Barley Bin. Rate our podcast, subscribe, and tell a friend to tune in wherever you listen to podcasts. Brought to you by SaskBarley, because it's time to get in the bin and get itchy.
Produced at
Sound Lounge by T-Bone.